Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you this colored pencil drawing of a cheetah lurking in the grass. And in addition to the colored pencils, I'm also going to use some pastel pencils. So initially I was planning to do this only in colored pencils. And I'm mostly going to be using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. I'm going to use a few other brands because I didn't have the specific colors that I wanted, but it's mostly Faber-Castell. But at one point, as you will see, I decided to add in some pastel pencils, because here I wanted to create an out of focus blurry background, and that is quite a bit easier to do with pastel pencils because their coverage is better and they're easier to blend, and you also see a lot less of the background color coming through. But anyway, I started out with colored pencils, laying down some of the tones which I wanted to have in the background. And as you can imagine, this was a bit slow with these colored pencils. So I started blending that a bit, and I saw that a lot of the background color was coming through and it was a little bit too bluish. The tone was a little bit too cool, and maybe I wanted it a bit warmer, so I started experimenting with some other colors. But eventually I decided that this would be a lot easier if I just used pastel pencils. Now there's a thing that I forgot to mention, and if you watched some of my previous videos, you would know this. I normally work on sandpaper when I use color pencils and pastel pencils. And here, as you can see, I switched to pastel pencils, and on sandpaper it's easy for me to apply pastel pencils over the colored pencils, or colored pencils over colored pencils for that matter, because this surface takes in many layers. It's a textured surface which allows you to build up layers and to work from dark to light as well as from light to dark. So that's one of the advantages of using sandpaper. If you can find artist quality sanded papers, that's great. But I normally can't find those, and they're a little bit too expensive for me, so I like to use regular sandpaper, and this is a 1000 grit sandpaper, which is a great surface for drawing in my experience. So let me get back to the drawing process. Here for the background I started adding some pastel pencils to create some of these yellowish tones with a few of the reddish and brownish tones, to make it look like I guess a grassy background, but it's out of focus and we can't really see any details. Now in the foreground, in the lower part of the drawing, I may add some blades of grass and some details, but I'm going to get to that later. Once I started working on the cheetah, on the main subject itself, I switched to colored pencils. Now the advantage of colored pencils is that they allow for more precision, and they also tend to stick to the surface of the paper a bit more, so they don't smudge as much. So these details will be a little bit easier to preserve. As for pastel pencils, they are easily blended, but they're also easily smudged. That's why I always prefer to do the details in colored pencil. Even when I started using pastels and pastel pencils, I often did these drawings which were a combination of pastels and colored pencils. And this combination works even better on sanded paper. But I mean, you could do this whole thing only using colored pencils, or only using pastel pencils on sandpaper, but of course you would have to change your approach slightly, and naturally you would have to accept the fact that Each of these types of pencils has their own, they have their own advantages and disadvantages. So I'm working here at the top, adding some brownish patches of fur. Now the interesting thing about these spots on leopards and cheetahs and stripes on tigers is that they almost appear black, like black dots or stripes on these animals. But the truth is that they're not really black. They're patches of really dark fur. And the fur is usually kind of really dark ochre or dark brown, sometimes even dark reddish brown. So I try to apply some of these brownish tones first, or ochreish tones first, and then add a bit of black to make them even darker. Now I should probably say a few words about the light source, because this scene has an interesting lighting. The right side is darker, so the light source is coming more from the left, and it's naturally coming from above. And the left side of the head is going to be a bit lighter, or quite a bit lighter, and some parts of the animal's head are going to be casting a shadow to the right. So I'm using some lighter colors here on the left. I'm using the ivory colored pencil, the Faber-Castell ivory colored pencil, for some of the lightest details, and for some of the lighter details which are not quite as light, I'm using some other lighter pencils. Now here I started working on the eye, and because the eyes are in the shadow, I have to make them a little bit darker, and I'm going to use some ochre and some orange tones for the eyes to make the color a bit more interesting. And of course I created a small highlight in the corner of the eye there, a small reflection. Now of course I have to shade around it so that the reflection would stand out, but the reflection itself is kind of subdued, because like I said, the eyes themselves are in the shadow. And now I'm starting to add some slightly darker bits of fur here, and mixing that with this lighter fur, with those lighter marks. Now, like I said, I used ivory for some of the lightest details, and for some of the slightly darker tones I'm going to use browns, but for those tones which are in between, I'm going to use this is something like light peach, almost like a skin tone type of color, and I used a Stadler and a Maped one because I couldn't find anything similar in my Faber-Castell range. But for these browns, brownish and ochre tones, I used burnt ochre, and I used a burnt sienna for some of these darker bits, and I'm also going to use some burnt umber, and of course I'm going to use black. But with these darker spots and patches of darker fur, I'm going to try to use other colors other than black, because I want to make the fur coat look a little more realistic and a little more interesting. So I want to make those look like patches of darker fur rather than just black spots. So the skin around the eye is pretty dark, and also here on the nose, on the muzzle area. I'm modifying the background a little bit also, but I'm going to be adding some details to it a bit later. Right now I just want it plain and smooth like this, without much detail. I'll decide what to do with it a bit later. I'm happy with what I've achieved here, because it's smooth and it's out of focus, and because the main subject is going to be so much more detailed and there's going to be a lot more texture on it, it's going to be drawing the attention of the viewer immediately. Now let me get back to talking about materials a bit more. So the size of this paper is a little bit smaller than usual. This is about, I think, 5 times 9 inches or so. So it's not a very large piece, but it's still fairly complex, so it took a few hours to complete. And like I said, the paper that I'm using is waterproof sandpaper, 1000 grit sandpaper. You can buy this at any hardware store, and it'll work just as well as some of the best or highest quality sanded papers. The only difference is that some people might worry about the archival qualities. Don't think you should be worried about that, because this paper is extremely durable. It's resistant to humidity, so it shouldn't be a problem. But I'm not too concerned about those archival qualities anyway. As for how it interacts with the pencils that I'm using, it allows you to add multiple layers and to work from dark to light, which is a huge advantage when working with colored pencils, because you can't do that on regular drawing paper. On regular drawing paper there is no chance that you can add small fine lighter details on top of the darker areas. Here you can do that quite easily. You can add some very light details on top, and you can also modify the details you've already created by working over them. You can modify the textures, you can do all kinds of things. The only disadvantage of this paper, I think, is that it just, with colored pencils naturally, it just doesn't allow you to cover large areas very quickly, even though in that respect it's also superior to regular drawing paper, because I think that on regular drawing paper it's also difficult to cover larger areas. With a colored pencil it takes quite a bit of patience. Here these things are a bit faster, but if you just rush it too much, a lot of the background color will come through, and sadly I have a limited number of colors of these sandpapers. They are mostly grayish or bluish in tone, and they're a little bit darker than the mid-tones that I would want to achieve. So that's a bit of a problem, but I sort of try to accept it as it is and try to work over it, because the advantages, the huge advantages are just they overweigh any disadvantages that I may encounter with this paper. It's really a pleasure working on sandpaper with colored pencils, because you can do so many things that you can't normally do on regular paper. So here you can see my approach in drawing these patches of fur. I'm using a combination of brown and also a bit of burnt sienna, and I'm softening that a little bit with a tortillon. I'm adding a bit of burnt sienna here and there to make them a bit more reddish, but I'm also paying attention to the fact that the right side of the body needs to be a little bit darker. I'm trying to add some other tones there, and then in the middle of these darker patches I'm also adding some black to make the fur look even darker, but gradually becoming a little bit lighter around the ends, around the edges. Now here I'm going back in with a lighter colored pencil. This is something like a light peach. I'm not really sure what it is, but it's a lighter colored pencil where I'm drawing some of the highlights, and for some of the even stronger highlights I'm using an ivory colored pencil, which is like a yellowish white, I guess. Just not completely white, but still a very light color. and I'm going to keep working with these lighter colored pencil to create a bit more depth in this fur, because the fur needs to be drawn so as to show its structure and shape and depth, and we have these clumps of fur, and some of those clumps are sticking out and catching more light from above, so they're a little bit lighter. And if you achieve that range of value, you'll have a nice realistic looking fur that has a little bit more depth to it and looks a bit more three-dimensional. So I did the other eye. The other eye is also in the shadow, but it's even darker than the one on the left. So I need to stay consistent with the light source, and I need to show consistently that everything on the right is darker than the left side of the head because of the light source. So here I'm introducing a little bit more of the mid-tone using this burnt ochre, which is going to be kind of my base color, and this reddish brown, which I used on the right side of the head, is going to be the base tone for that dark side of the head. And then I work on top of that, adding some lighter details. This is a part of the drawing process which is a little bit slower, because I need to make a whole bunch of these smaller strokes, and sometimes I do these with darker colored pencils, sometimes with slightly lighter colored pencils, but the idea is that I need to pay attention to the length and the direction of the fur in my references. So whenever you're drawing furry animals, if you want to draw a realistic looking fur, it's not enough to just draw a whole bunch of lines or to get the colors right. It's also important to try to get the texture to look right, and the way that you can do this is to make sure that the length of your strokes and the direction of your strokes matches the length of the fur and the direction of the fur. So if the fur here is growing kind of upwards on the forehead area, that's how you have to do it. You have to pull those strokes vertically, and if it's kind of changing an angle around the eyebrow area, you have to follow that angle, you have to follow that direction. And the same thing is with the length of the fur. If the fur is a lot shorter around the eye area and the muzzle area, or rather the snout area, you have to make sure that your strokes are shorter in that area. And if the fur is getting a bit longer around the top of the head and the sides of the head, you have to try to pull slightly longer pencil strokes to create slightly longer marks. And if you do that, and if you're patient enough, you will create a fairly realistic looking fur, fairly realistic looking texture of the fur. But all this will be useless if you fail to capture the larger relationships on the subject's head, on your subject, the larger relationships between the light and shadow, because then you will fail to explain the shape of whatever it is that you're drawing. So in order to show volume and depth in your subject, you need to define these larger relationships, and you need to stay consistent with the light source. So I need to make sure that the left side of the head, which I just did, remains a lot lighter than the right side, because that is the part of the head and that is the part of the body which is facing towards the light source, and the right side is the part that is facing away from the light source. So it needs to stay darker. But the light source is usually also coming from above. It's coming more from the left here, but it's also coming from above. So the upper part of the head, and that part of the transition between the head and the neck area, is going to be a lot lighter, as you can see. So I'm going to be using those lighter colored pencils, that light peach, whatever it is, and that ivory colored pencil, on the top of the head and of course on the left side of the head. So I'm doing the same thing with these darker patches of these spots that I did on the top of the body, in the top right of my drawing. Basically using a combination of some brownish tones and a black. As for the pencils that I'm using, I've already mentioned that these are mostly Faber-Castell Polychromos. Those are probably my favorite colored pencils right now. But I also like to use some other cheaper brands because sometimes I don't have all of the colors that I need. And here I use a couple of Maped and Staedtler ones, but I mean, if you are doing a similar drawing like this, or if you want to attempt to draw something like this and you don't have these brands, you can just try to find an equivalent color, and I'm sure it will be fine, because the thing is that regardless of how nice your reference photo is, you'll never get the colors to look exactly the same. I don't think that's entirely possible. But even if you don't, you shouldn't really worry about that too much. It's about conveying the general feeling and the general idea, and making it look kind of similar. And sometimes you just have to simplify and approximate certain things, and I don't see a problem with that. I think this patch of darker fur above the eyebrow area is a little bit, or at least was a little bit displaced, so I was kind of trying to move it a little bit more to the left. And here I'm moving on to drawing some more of these spots on the right side. I'm softening some of them a little bit using brushes and tortillons, because I don't want the fur to look too coarse and too artificial. I want it to look a little bit more natural. That's why I like to soften it or fluff it up a little bit more. Now in those areas where the fur is a little bit longer, like above the head in the top right part, it's okay to create a slightly more out of focus and softer appearance of the fur. Here on the head, especially around that snout area, where the fur is shorter, you want to have a little bit more texture, and maybe strokes, pencil strokes or pencil marks which are a little bit more defined and a bit less blurry. I normally keep a piece of cardboard under my paper. I like to tape the paper to a piece of cardboard, just so that I don't have the rough surface of the desk directly under the drawing paper. So this is this darker area, which is kind of extending from the corner of the eye to the tear duct to all the way to the snout and mouth area. And I think it makes a nice contrast with the lighter fur, and it gives the cheetah's head a very interesting shape, a very interesting appearance. Wildcats in general are always interesting to draw as subjects. Here at the bottom I'm doing a little bit more of the background, and I'm using a bit more of the pastel pencil. Let me get back to talking about some of the properties of pastels and pastel pencils. So on sanded papers and on this regular sandpaper that I'm using, they tend to stick to the surface of the paper pretty well, but they tend to stick to the paper a lot better than they do to the regular paper. But the problem is that pastels are never really fixed. You can use a fixative, but the thing is that there will always be a little bit of dust coming off, and if you are bothered by that, you may want to you may want to not use pastels in a combination with a colored pencil. The reason why I think this combination works is because for the larger blurry areas I can use more of the pastel pencil, but for the details I use the colored pencil, and even if somebody touches the drawing accidentally, those details in colored pencil are less likely to be ruined, because the colored pencils, the colored pencil marks, they tend to stick to the surface of the paper a little bit better. Whereas if I were to do the whole thing in pastel, you just touch any of the details and it's completely ruined. It's like the wings of a butterfly. It's very, very delicate, and that's one of the things that I don't like about pastels. But pastels are a pleasure to work with, especially on a sanded surface like this, where you can do almost anything you like. I mean, you can add an incredible amount of layers, you can add lighter details on top of the darker areas, you can do all kinds of things. But like I said, fixing them will be an issue, and if you want to fix them a bit more thoroughly, you will unfortunately end up changing colors if you use a larger amount of fixative. So I like to fix them somewhat and to use them in a combination with a colored pencil, and that way I can create a piece that's not quite as prone to smudging. So here I added some details to make the grass look more interesting here in the foreground. I first added some suggestions of some lighter blades of grass sticking out, and I also added some slightly different greenish tones and slightly darker tones. And now I'm using this ivory colored pencil to draw some of the lighter blades of grass, and I'm also using a brown to add some of the darker stems to make this foreground area a bit more interesting, a bit more complex. I don't want it to be quite as detailed so as to draw the attention of the viewer, but I want it to I want to make it look like this area is a bit more detailed, or appears a bit more detailed, because it's in the foreground and it's kind of getting more and more blurry and less defined as you look into the distance. So I still have a lot of work to do on the texture of the fur, and I'm working on the this short light fur around the mouth and the snout area. Here I'm going to be using a lot of this ivory colored pencil, and this is one of my favorite colored pencils. I use it for all kinds of effects. It's not completely white, but it's very, very light, and I find myself using it a lot when I draw wildlife as well as some other things. So you can see these whiskers that I drew. They're very easy to pull with a colored pencil on sandpaper. Even if I were to draw something darker under them using darker colored pencils, I would still be able to pull those lighter details with a white colored pencil or an ivory colored pencil very easily, because this textured surface really allows you to add layers upon layers. I mean, you can't add layers and details indefinitely, but you can certainly do that more easily than you would on regular drawing paper. So here I'm doing a bit more work on the snout area, and as I'm gradually moving towards the right side, things are going to be getting a little bit darker. So the challenge here will be creating that transition while at the same time maintaining the complexity of the texture. And you can also see that I'm using a bit of pastel pencil to lay down some base tones for the fur, and I'm working on top of that with a burnt sienna, adding some darker details, and I'm also adding some darker browns and even some black around this nose area where we have some slightly darker fur. So you can see that the texture of the fur is getting more and more complex, but I still haven't added the lighter details or highlights to it. I'm going to be doing that a bit later. And now, if you're still watching the video, let me just remind you to subscribe if you haven't already, and also don't forget to give me a like and comment on my videos, because all of these things mean a lot for my channel. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I have lots of drawings of many different subjects in different techniques, so there's something for everybody. And if you want to see longer videos, full-length videos with a lot more narration, then you should check out my Patreon. I have hundreds upon hundreds of hours of real-time footage and dozens of full-length narrated videos where you can observe the drawing process in real time, and where you can see and hear much more detailed explanations of how I did my drawings. So you can see here I'm starting to add those lighter details on top, and you can see how this is already starting to make the fur look a lot more three-dimensional, because it's starting to give it a lot more depth. Now here it's very important not to get too carried away and try to overwork it, because a few suggestions here and there usually do the trick. You don't have to draw every single hair, but the thing is that if you want to do a realistic, detailed looking drawing, you have to put in a lot of work. Here I'm just making sure that some of these darker spots on the sides of the head are a little bit darker, using a black colored pencil. And I'm slowly working my way towards the right side of the face, if you will, towards the right side of the head, or the lower right side of the head. And then finally the neck and the chest area, which will complete the drawing. So again, I'm using a bit of pastel pencil to block in some of the base tones, and then I start working on that on top of that using colored pencils. Pastels are obviously very easy to blend with your finger, but you would be surprised if you haven't worked on sanded surfaces. It's also a little bit easier to blend colored pencils as well. Of course, not as easy as pastel pencils, but a little bit easier than it is on regular paper, because you can move that pigment around a little bit more easily. So here I decided to draw a few more of these darker spots to get things moving, because I kind of got tired of working on the texture of the fur. The thing is that when you're drawing subjects like this, this can be a little bit tedious and a little bit daunting. So one of the ways that you can make it easier for yourself and maintain the motivation is to work segment by segment. Now I know this is not always recommended, because sometimes you can get caught up into drawing textures and you can forget about the larger relationships between the light side and the shadow side. But maybe you can do a combination of two. Maybe you can first make some indications of where the shadow areas are, and then start refining the details in specific areas. And I find that when you have something as complex as this, it's a lot easier for you kind of mentally and psychologically, and it's a lot easier to decide, well, now I'm just going to do top left segment of the head, for example. I'm just going to do that part first, and then I'm going to move on to the segment under it, and basically move just by doing a couple of square inches at a time. And that way you can see some progress that you're making with the fur and with the texture, and you can Prevent yourself from being discouraged or maybe even bored during the drawing process, because obviously some parts of this drawing are a little bit more interesting than others. Some parts of this drawing process are a little bit repetitive. I mean, when you look at wildlife drawings, they're usually colorful, they're usually interesting, and they usually look like something that would be a lot of fun to draw, especially in color. But the thing is that some parts, because they're so detailed and lively, some parts of that drawing process require a lot of patience, and they can be very monotonous, so you need to try to find ways to stay motivated. And that's one of the reasons why I like working on sorry about that, why I like working on smaller pieces of paper. It's much better to practice on those, and it's a lot more fun. I mean, I prefer smaller sized drawings anyway. So here I have some more whiskers on this right side, and again, it's so easy to pull these light details on sandpaper. As you can see, it's not a problem at all. I'm refining the right side of the head by adding some lighter details, trying to make sure that my strokes are pretty short and that they match the overall direction and length of the fur in whichever part of the head that I'm working on at the moment. I can already see some problems with the right side of the head here, because I need to make it a bit darker, so I'm going to start introducing some slightly darker tones here, and I'm going to see if I can add a bit more shadow, because this is the shadow side, so it needs to be darker than the left side. So I need to stay consistent with the light source, and I'm going to have to be adding some darker tones to that side of the head. Here under the head, in that I'm not really sure what that is. It's kind of like a shoulder and chest area. The fur is very light on the left side, and it's gradually becoming darker and darker as we move to the right. I'm going to try to make a nice transition there, and also I'm going to try to make the fur appear fluffy and longer and softer in that part of the body, because the hair, the fur on the head is a little bit shorter and a little bit coarse, a little bit more coarse in its appearance on the head, especially around the snout area, and it appears to be getting longer and fluffier around the chest and the top of the back and some other areas. I'm just adding some lighter details, modifying the outer edge, and adding some of these lighter, longer flyaway hairs on the side of the head and on the jaw area, and just refining the whiskers a little bit as well, maybe adding a few more touches to the background, but the drawing is mostly done. I like the contrast between the blurry background and the detailed main subject. I'm going to put my signature in the lower left corner, and I haven't quite finished here. I just wanted to refine some of these darker patches of fur to make them look a bit more natural. I didn't really like some of their edges, and I also added some other details and modified the appearance of the right eye, or the eye on the right a bit, by adding something like a small subdued reflection in it. But that's it for this drawing. I want to thank you for watching, and like I said, don't forget to check out my other videos. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.